Hi, I'm Phil Kurz, contributing editor for TV Technology Magazine and TVTech.com. The media and entertainment industry has entered an era of rapid change, spanning the breadth of content preparation, distribution, and even business workflows. Today's guest and his company are assisting M&E organizations as they navigate the changing landscape. I'm joined by Andy Shenkler, Chief Executive Officer at TMT Insights. His company advises the C-suite as they consider their company's digital transitions, cloud strategy, sales strategy, and more. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for having me.
Let's get started. The media supply chain is changing rapidly as media organizations supplement or replace their on-prem capabilities with those in the cloud. How's all this playing out?
Well, there's obviously a lot of shifting in the landscape that's happened just over the last 5 years. We went from a whole world of the streaming wars, if you would, to a world where, moving to the cloud, where it was once kind of, people were dipping their toe in the water. Now that's becoming more accelerated and people wanting to leverage all of the power that's in the cloud, and they're much more comfortable with it. And so it kind of forces organizations to have to look at the, you know, ecosystem, their teams, and just everything that comprises that to figure out what's the best way to kind of go through that change. And change is difficult for organizations. You got to take people with you, and there's kind of a usual bell curve around that of people who are very excited, people who are terrified, and then people who are committed but don't really know how to help through that. And so that's where we come in, helping organizations at all levels be able to kind of weather that.
So it sounds like companies probably need to rethink how they approach this and how they're structured, especially when it comes to the evolution of their supply chains. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, what are some of the top things that they need to keep in mind?
So I absolutely agree with that statement, and I think one of the biggest pitfalls probably right now is that everybody loves to chase things like AI. That's like the hot topic, both from a stock market perspective and just what it opens up and affords people as opportunity. But oftentimes there's a lot of fool's gold out there, right? And so you can't pendulum swing from one aspect to the other without kind of going through and rethinking about how you approach stuff. And I take that very much, I think that's something that's happened all throughout history. Like even when we made the divide from tape-based workflows to file-based workflows, people would take the same overall linear flow, cross out the word tape, write the word file, and say, miraculously, I'm now digital. But in reality, it's how do you organize yourself? What are the kind of groups of people and the team dynamics that you need in order to facilitate that? There's all new skill sets that you may need to be able to actually leverage all of that. So there's an infinite amount of possibilities. But yes, organizations need to be, very considerate about what that transformation looks like.
And it seems to me that this transformation from a CapEx to an OpEx sort of business model also may it raises a lot of opportunities, obviously, but also may be brand new for some media organizations as they structure their costs and what they have to report to their shareholders, et cetera. And just wondering what is the larger effect of this transition to an OpEx model?
So it's actually interesting, and we've started to see even some of that, regress into some of the older economic models more recently. So, obviously, when you go from a capex to an opex model, you're living with all of the costs on a every day, every month basis, and there's a lot of advantages to that because with the burstability, and you don't have to have all of that outlay of cash up front, and you can start to leverage things only as you use them. That's very attractive. However, that was also very attractive during a time when money was very cheap, right? So if you're, borrowing against it and, raising debt and things like that, depending on what your organization, how they choose to finance things, when interest rates were incredibly low, it was like, this is great. Suddenly, as interest rates have started to increase, we've seen and heard from the different financial parts of the organizations that there's a desire to move some of that back to a capex model where they can depreciate some of this on their books. I think that what there's kind of been this world of thought that things would depreciate for 3 years and then you replace stuff. And I think now we're in a world where actually it's not 3 years anymore. tools and software get used for 5 and 7 years. And so suddenly, if you're just paying every single month on a subscription basis or some level of OPEX, how do you start to weather that for things that become effectively a fixed cost for your organization when you know realistically there isn't going to be that ebb and flow? So I think there's dynamics in that that have come into play, and it's really finding the balance of when to use each of them appropriately.
So going into this year, TMT made some market predictions, I believe. What did you see for 2024?
So, I mean, unfortunately, we saw things like, more layoffs coming. We saw that there was going to be, I don't know that it would so much be consolidation, but, obviously, but, Paramount is now up for sale. We saw that there was going to be just the fact that revenue was going to be down from a consumer experience perspective. That obviously has a knock on effect. Obviously, the strikes from last year had a material impact to how organizations were planning to handle that, not knowing when those would come to a conclusion. And even though that they ended in Q4 of last year, things were already in place. And you could start to see some stuff like, Paramount announced that they did 800 layoffs the day after the Super Bowl. And there was a lot of like, social media messaging of like, well, how can it be the biggest Super Bowl and you lay off 800 people? As if the cause and effect were literally tied to something that happened just 24 hours before, which we all know is not how these things operate. And so a lot of the things that were set in motion, just because there's a slight recovery for a moment in time doesn't mean that, that you can change the direction of that ship. And so, unfortunately, yes, we've seen the continuation of that. We've seen that there's been, reduction in force, not just in the media side, but also the technology partners that have leveraged, so much of this over the last several years that, we're starting to see a new landscape kind of come out from all of that in terms of who even controls what within an organization.
Yeah, I've been curious about the vendor community just for a second, if we can go off in that direction with what you just said. So many of these businesses have built their business on building big iron and then COTS based, solutions. And now transitioning to the cloud. Now, obviously, they were software companies also kind of behind. But have you found that the vendor community, the technology vendor community, is making this transition where so many of their applications, so many of their tools are going to be running in the cloud, and their cost structure for development is different, as well as what they probably can charge their customers for their products?
So, yeah. Well, so we'll come back to what you can charge a customer in a second. But to the first part of your question, yes, we're seeing, an enormous amount of adoption to cloud. It also becomes about which cloud and are you multi-cloud enabled or single cloud? We see obviously an enormous amount in AWS, GCP, and Google Cloud. There's been a lot of pickup. We tend to see a little less on Microsoft, to be fair, but you've got a myriad of things. Those are the big three, but there's Oracle, IBM, Alibaba, right? So there's any number of things that need to be considered with all of that stuff, but all of them in earnest are moving that way, right? We're seeing much more, especially on the heavy lift of production workflows, visual effects, things like that, all moving to cloud-based environments. From a sales perspective, yes, I think a lot of them have to rethink how they're doing it, because when you had kind of an intrinsic, quote, let's say a physical product, so to speak, right? It was very easy to say, this thing has a cost, and therefore it's a cost plus, or I can defend it. Now it's much more about value pricing. Now it's more about like, well, what is the value that this thing adds to your business? What is it supporting you for? And how much do you feel that that is worth to you? Because, you start to look at it, and once you're in the cloud, it's like, well, who's really making the most of the money? Is it an AWS who's running all of the machinery? Or if a client is running it within their own environment, are they incurring all of those costs directly? And so are you just literally the piece of software? So there's a lot of just rethinking of how do you package that and present that to companies now.
And then getting back to the M&E side of the business, one of the things that I hear when I interview various folks from that is that they are concerned about egress charges when it comes to the cloud. Is that a big impediment? Is it being addressed? How does that fit into the whole scheme?
So yes, egress has been. I've always said that assets are, for the M&E business. Assets are the gravity for all of this, right? So you can run your data processing in one, cloud. You could run, some logic and AI in another. But if you've got 10 petabytes of content and that's where you need to process it, that's materially where everything is going to happen, right? Unless you really have, both the cache available to kind of do multi-cloud and replicate everything and have disaster recovery that way, or business continuity, very much people are single selecting clouds. And so, yeah, egress is a big piece. Now, we've started to see messages from Google and AWS and others who are saying, we're no longer going to stand in your way if you want to move between one cloud and another for the purposes of migration, because the hostage model no longer kind of appeals to everyone. And as more and more recipients of content move to the cloud, that also makes it a little less costly and painful, because instead of having to deliver out to all of these different head ends and data centers, you're really just moving it within cloud environments themselves. And so if the propensity of your client base that you're sending to is, located on AWS, then obviously it's moving within the internal infrastructure within that company. So still costs, but it's heavily reduced.
So, a little bit prior, you mentioned the whole change in the workforce restructuring and continued consolidation and sales and mergers and things. Are there any new TMT offerings that can help media organizations as it begins to travel down, the path that you predicted?
Yeah. So both things that are, that we deal with right now, and also things that we're working on with some of our clients from a future state perspective. So at the moment, we have our Polaris product that sits as a single pane of glass that sits across the entire complex ecosystem of the digital supply chain. One of the biggest problems within these organizations that we've heard time and time again is that when you have this kind of federated group of responsibility, whether it's sales, finance, content operations, and engineering, they're all kind of myopically looking at their tool sets, and they're all talking within their own language, so to speak. And as you try and kind of cross pollinate and have them understand each other, it's very difficult to try and do that when they don't have one single place to look and have a common nomenclature for which to refer to everything. And so Polaris really sets out to solve that problem for them, so that you have consistency in how people collaborate with each other for those workflows. And on a go forward basis, providing more visibility to the sales and finance parts of the organization, so that they have more visibility into what happens downstream, knowing that they don't need to understand all the processes of, like, how do you transform something and things like that. But sales cares about, what can I go execute on today without having to have somebody go spend 30 hours doing data analysis? How do I just go in and say, what part of this catalog is available for me if I want to go license it in Latin America? What do I do? What's available? How do I do that? And finance wants to then know, what's the value of that deal and what's it going to cost to manufacture all of that stuff, because obviously they want to put parameters in that says, if it goes over a certain level, maybe there's certain approvals, things like that. And today, all of that happens, but sometimes we know how the real world works. It happens after a deal got signed. Now you're having to go back and unwind something, or you're just facing the pain of whatever it was in hopes that the next deal will kind of make up for it. So we're really trying to answer those questions with them to solve that in real time.
So you have been on record as predicting a shift in power within media organizations, from the CTO to the CFO, and it sounds like what you just described is touching on that whole uh, movement. How is this all playing out?
So I think, yes, I've definitely been on record for that, and I think, as with anything, there's always shifting, power in any organization, and I think it's just about moments in time. And the real key is to find the balance in an organization, right? It's not healthy for any one group to be the one that's kind of leading the organization by its nose. It's about, how do you get all of them to work in conjunction with each other, which is why things like what I was just describing with Polaris is so important, so that everybody is kind of talking with that one voice. But what we've seen happen is, whether it was through COVID and, just the urgency that everyone had of spinning up more content, localizing it, getting it out there for people to consume, there was almost this unrelenting kind of like, just go as fast as you can. Even the amount of content that was being created, Bob Iger's been on record of saying, probably didn't make some of the best decisions, needed to change our strategy, things like that. So I don't think it's a surprise or secret to anyone. But after you've done that massive buildup in spend and growth, then obviously the pendulum is going to swing the other way at some point. And right now, when there's the consolidation and such a focus on the bottom line, that swing goes back to the finance community and the CFOs who are saying, hang on a minute, we're not just going to go do this, kind of blindly. We need better controls in place that maybe they skipped a little bit of for the speed that they wanted to operate at.
Right, right. Because I always thought there was a level of pretty good cooperation on the C level between the financial folks and the tech folks. And, the tech folks weren't going to be able to acquire new technology or promote new workflows if they didn't have the financial folks on board. And, vice versa. Financial people aren't just going to go spend money on something. They want the consultation with the tech side of the business. So you're saying it's kind of like a pendulum.
Yeah, it's a bit of a pendulum, and yes, that's true. I mean, I don't mean to imply that one team can just run out with the credit card and buy whatever they want. The other team has no idea what's happening. That's not the impetus. What it really is that there was an urgency that was created by market demand that suddenly you're no longer in hey, let's go through a year business planning cycle and figure out what we're going to do. It's we're going to miss the window if we do not do X. We need to spin stuff up, right? So whether it's we're going to you have the Paramount Global, we have the Paramount Plus, we have Showtime, we've got Pluto, we've got okay, well, that's a lot of stuff going on. Now we got a consolidation plan. You got Disney Plus, you got Netflix running out there chasing everybody with a high degree of content catalog that they're making instead of just acquiring now. So then there's the chase of who has originals and how much of that is being created. So it's more or less that, just the pressures in the market and the speed that everybody was operating at, that they had more liberties than they probably do at the moment.
So, do you have any best practices that you can recommend for media organizations to achieve this balance across their supply chain?
Sure. The first one is they should call us. That's the best practice they could do. No. So I think one of the biggest things that people need to do is, and it kind of harks back to what I was saying earlier in regards to that, taking a tape-based workflow, crossing out tape, writing file, is that you really need to think about how you're kind of coming at the problem. So as a good example of this is, you might have an organization that has 15 people servicing different clients, and maybe they're not really kind of engaged with each other because they're all kind of doing their day-to-day stuff, and that's no fault of their own. It's just what happens in the real world. And so let's say 5 of them are working on getting content into the system, but they don't know that the others are actually doing the same thing for the same titles. So now you've maybe created orders for 5 different things to be chased for, right? And instead it's flip it on its head and start to consolidate those things and say, well, maybe what I need is a team of people who are only focused on curating, who are then looking at the kind of many to one and consolidating those requests so that you have less friction in the supply chain, you have less cost in it. But that requires you to change your organization potentially. Not everybody, some have already done it, but that's just a microcosm of all of the different ways to think about it. And like we were saying about sales, giving visibility to sales up front of what's available immediately versus what they have to go create. And so maybe their dynamics of how they're packaging things is different so that it's not this massive chase to go create something in order to deliver for a timeline. All of those pieces are about the kind of the best practice of how you should just rethink what's happening in order to leverage all the power that you've got at your disposal.
Well, that's where we're going to need to leave it today. I want to thank you, Andy, for sharing your perspectives. Be sure to check out TVTech.com for continuing coverage of these important issues. For TVTech, I'm Phil Kurz. Thanks for watching.